Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Sin and Tonic. Today's story is that of the World's End murders. It took an awfully long time for justice to be served for the two victims. 37 years. Let's go. Sadly, there is no gin for me because I have a warm beverage. I'm not feeling great. So we're going to see how this goes, because earlier my voice did go. We can but try. Cheers. A cup of coffee or a cup of tea with a couple of biscuits. Oh, yes. Now, the reason that this case is often referred to as the World's End murders is because the two victims, that was the pub that they were last seen alive in, the World's End pub. On the 15th of October in 1977, 4 teenage girls went out on a night out. They were 17 and you could probably get away with drinking in a pub a bit earlier than that. I'm sure I did. Never. But the point was they were underage. In the UK, you can go out and drink legally in a pub at 18, and these girls were 17. 2 of the girls were called Kristine and Helen Scott. And they went way back, so they were childhood friends. They'd gone to school together. They were very, very close friends that had known each other for a very long time. And they were chalk and cheese. And sometimes that just really works really nicely, doesn't it, in friendships? Helen was described as more quiet, very family orientated. She really loved animals and younger children. She liked to take care of people and animals. She was quite sweet, it sounded like. I'm sure Kristine was incredibly sweet as well. She was different in the fact that she had a really larger than life personality. She was more of the life and soul of the party, whereas Helen was more quiet and refined. On that evening when they ended up in the World's End pub, there was 4 of them. At one point, the two other girls, they went to the toilet together, as you do. Take your friend, always. Little chat, bit of makeup, talk about the boys. Again, I wouldn't know. The pub was busy. This was in, I didn't tell you where we were. Edinburgh. Okay, Edinburgh in Scotland. I won't do a Scottish accent, but I do love their accent. It is absolutely just... I work with a girl who's got a Scottish accent. Well, she's Scottish. And, you know, when you just want someone to speak, just talk to me. I love it. Scottish. Witnesses on the evening said that when these other 2 girls went to the loo, Kristine and Helen were then approached by 2 older men. They sat down at their table and they started chatting. Conversation was flowing. It was also noted that the costumes, the attire, the clothes that they were wearing were unusual to the area. So it wasn't the fashion that they were accustomed to. So it made everybody think that they were out of area. They weren't from Edinburgh. Their 2 friends came back from the toilet and they were like, oh, there's a party, shall we go? You know, there's a party tonight. Let's head there. But Kristine and Helen, really sadly, because this doesn't end well for Kristine and Helen, as you probably guessed, they said no, and that they were happy at the pub talking to their new friends and that they didn't want to go to the party. So their 2 friends left and they went to the party, and it just makes you feel so sad because it's like, what if? Like they should have gone. Kristine and Helen left the World's End pub at closing. It's assumed with the older men. They were last seen on St Mary's Street, and they were walking slightly ahead of 2 older men. And it was as if they were together in a group, but the girls were walking ahead and the older men were like hanging back a little bit and they were chatting. Really sadly, that was the last time they were seen. Their parents were not overly concerned that the girls didn't come home. Both sets of parents assumed that one girl was staying at the others and the others, you know, and that was quite usual. There were no mobile phones here because this was 1977. So it wasn't like you could ring your mum and say, I'm staying at so-and-so's house. It wasn't until the next day that the parents realised that the girls hadn't stayed at each other's houses. And this is when alarm bells were ringing, because this was not usual for the girls. They were quite good girls. They would have normally slept over at one or the other's house. So this was then like a cause for concern. So later on that day, they were reported missing. Really heartbreakingly, it was that afternoon that they heard on the radio that a body had been found. I mean, I cannot imagine that. I just can't. There was a place called Gosford Bay, and 2 dog walkers, again, can't imagine being in that position, came across the naked body of Kristine, and it wasn't a pleasant sight. Kristine was on her back, like I said, and she was completely naked. She had been bound and gagged with her underwear and her tights, and she'd been quite badly beaten. It would later be discovered in the autopsy that she had been raped and that she had been strangled with her own clothing. So something had been fashioned that was then used to strangle her with. The police knew that the girls were together the night before, so then they were desperate to find Helen, and really sadly, it wasn't a better outcome for Helen. She was found a few hours later in a field down a country lane, not very far from Kristine. Interestingly, they never found Helen's shoes. So she was naked as well, and again, it was the same situation. Her clothes had been used to strangle her. She was bound and gagged with items of her own clothing. She had been strangled with her clothes. She had also been beaten, and she had also been raped. The police knew that this was the same perpetrator or perpetrators, but yeah, they never ever found her shoes. She was found wearing her coat. So she had no other clothes on but her coat. That was different to Kristine, who was completely naked. Other than that, everything was very, very similar. And there had been no effort whatsoever by the killer to hide the bodies, basically. They were just left to be found. The investigation would then begin into their murders, and it had rocked the community. This really, really, really shocked everybody. Now, this was in 1977, like I said, so the forensic side of things, not so fabulous. It's not like it is now, but using their brains, and I think this is really clever, the police investigators for this case, they kept everything. They basically thought ahead and thought, you know, one day there'll be advancements in technology and forensic science, so we will tag, bag, keep everything that we can for the future. They were like forward thinking. They also spoke to everybody. They had to find everybody that was in that pub that night, the World's End pub. This was the last place they had frequented, and they needed to know everything they could about that evening. From witness statements, they found out about the 2 older men and the movements of the girls in the pub that night. They also had enough to make sketches of the 2 men, and they were, I'll share a picture, they were released to the public, and over the following year, they would receive thousands of tips, but nothing ever amounted to anything. And it must have just been so frustrating because there was just nothing. There was just nothing. They did have forensic evidence, but they didn't have the means to test it. And they had witness statements, but they never found the men. And they followed up on all of the tips and things that they did get, and it always just came to nothing. So it was just very, very frustrating. Over the years, they really did believe that there were 2 killers. Eventually, the case became a cold case because nothing was coming up. How could one person overcome 2 fit, healthy teenage girls? It seemed implausible. So they really thought they were looking for 2 killers. Also, don't forget, the last time the girls were seen, they were with 2 older men. So that was their thinking. And then, with the advancements of forensics, as they had hoped, things started to come together. This was years later. And they managed to find trace DNA on both of the girls, things that they'd collected from the girls. And it was only from one person. So they were like, okay, maybe it was just the one guy then. They quickly put his DNA into the DNA database. No match. Gutting, because that would have just been like, yes, please, done. But no, there was no match. 27 years later, in 2004, there had been a very small piece of Helen's coat that they had kept. This is gross. They kept it because it had like semen stains on it. So that was kept, and that did not match the DNA that they had previously found. So whoa. Rewind it, because now we're right back to 2 killers. Okay, so this is a sample of another man. Again, they put this into the DNA database, and this time, ka-ching! Yeah, they find a match. Yes, we say. Enter Angus, the dickhead Sinclair. Hold on to your hats, because he is a case. At this point, he is 59 years old. So that would have made him 31 at the time of the murders. And guess where Angus Sinclair was? In prison. Yes, already in prison, serving life. This was for multiple sexual offences against young women and children, awfully, and 2 murders. Okay, Angus, let's go. A little bit about him. He was born in 1945. He was the youngest of 3 siblings, and he lived in Glasgow, growing up. Sadly, when he was 4, his dad died. It's always very sad when someone loses a parent when they're a child, isn't it? And it was said that his mum wasn't great after that, and that there was no real support and loving environment for the children. Despite all of this, he was a good chap and a bit of a loner, but not naughty at this point, a good boy. That did not last, and when he was 14, his life of crime would begin. Started with petty theft and smaller crimes, quite often does, doesn't it? He would break into people's houses, and he'd always get caught. He'd get caught, and then he'd get put on probation, and he'd just keep doing it. He'd break the rules of his probation. He was just really like acting out, really, look, big time. At 15, 16, this is when he committed his first sexual offence, and it's so sad. It was against an 8-year-old girl that lived on his street. And then 6 months later, I don't like this because I don't like talking about children normally, but okay, we'll just be quick with it. 6 months later, his family were all away or out of town for the day or what have you, so it was premeditated. He lured another 8-year-old girl from locally and said, could she go to the shop and get him some chocolate, sweets or whatever, and then when she'd got them, come back and he'd give her the money for it. That was just to lure her in to the house. She came back and he sexually assaulted her, and then he strangled her to death, and then proceeded to throw her body down the stairs, and then called an ambulance. So he thought that by throwing her down the stairs when she passed away, that they would just assume she fell down the stairs and that's how she died, but they knew that that wasn't the case. He was charged at 16 to spend 10 years in prison. It must be because he was under 18, because 10 years for raping and murdering an 8-year-old girl, that does not sit right with me. Must have been because he was a juvenile. So he ended up, worse than that, he only ended up serving 7 years, because I don't know why. I didn't actually find out why, sorry. But he ended up only serving 7 years of that sentence. So he must have come out at, let's do some maths. I do need my fingers. It's 23. So at 23 years old, he then was released after serving time for rape and murder. The mind boggles, really. It seemed that he came out of prison and tried to reform himself. He became like a painter and a decorator. He met somebody, I think she was called Sarah, and they had a child together. And it seemed on the front of it that he was like living a normal life, family, job, that sort of thing? No. He was still sexually abusing young children between the ages of 6 and 14. Piece of shit. Thankfully, he wasn't like the best criminal mastermind, and he was caught and he was charged with sexual assault of these many young girls. He ended up being charged for 3 rapes. I mean, that's enough, but I think he was involved in more. They said that he was a permanent danger to children. Yes, he was. Thank you, please. And in 1982, he was given a life sentence because he was just too much of a danger to young girls. Let me try and tie together where we are so far, because my brain just got confused, so let me help you in case you're the same. So he served time from 16 to 23 for the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl. He came out of prison and then continued to sexually abuse young girls, and then received a life sentence in 1982. So he's in prison. And then in 2001, there is DNA evidence linking him to another murder. This is the murder of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher. She was murdered in 1976. This was 1 year before the murder of Kristine and Helen. Now, very similar MO, strangled with items of her own clothing, beaten, raped. This time he had also cut her throat, but the strangulation with items of her own clothes and everything, it was very similar, and they found his DNA. There was a court case for this. So even though he's in prison serving time for sexually assaulting children, he comes to court to face the charges of murder. Even though he's in there for life, he still lied. He said, it was just a coincidence. I did sleep with her. She must have been murdered later on. Shut up. So that's what he said. He was convicted of her murder. So he's now been found guilty in his life so far of 2 murders and numerous sexual assaults on young children. It's quite the list. 2004 would come around, and this is when the forensic evidence pointed the finger at him for the murder of Kristine and Helen. So it's all coming out of the woodwork, isn't it? The police, looking into the investigation again, that we're into 2004 again, they really want to know who the second guy is, because the DNA forensic evidence is saying that there was another person involved in this. That is the DNA that they have found on the victims previously. So they really want to know, and they really want to find this guy. They then start looking at Angus Sinclair in depth. Every man that's ever been a part of his life, because they need to they need to piece it all together. They want to get him convicted for these 2 murders as well. And they also want to maybe bring to justice whoever this other guy is, hopefully. This is where it gets spicy and really sad for his wife. So Angus Sinclair was married to Sarah Hamilton, and he had a daughter with her, and this was before he went to prison for life for sexual abuse. So she had 4 brothers. When they looked at the DNA, they discovered that the DNA that they had found had familial links, I think I've said that correctly, to none other than Sinclair's bloody wife. So, and they managed to eliminate 3 of her brothers. So one of her brothers is also a dirty sod. Imagine that. Your husband is a vile paedophile, and now also your brother. They find the brother in question. It's Gordon Hamilton, and he has actually passed away. He passed away in 1996, and his body was cremated. So they had no DNA to like a piece of DNA to match and make a positive match between the sample that they have from the victims and him. So they need this. They ask all of the family members, do you have any keepsakes or trinkets, like a hairbrush that we can get DNA from? No. That seems like it's all going to fall a bit flat, but they really, really want to confirm that this DNA is Gordon's and they can piece this together. Then, and this is just bizarrio, A member of the family, a friend of the family, comes forward and says, oh, you know, he did some like DIY handiwork for us at our house. Wonder if you could get DNA from like that, because he'd fitted like coving in their property, in their house. So they were like, you know, he was up here putting coving up. Like, do you think you could get DNA from that? Well, they tried and succeeded. So they managed to get Gordon's DNA off this piece of coving. Hope they replaced it for the people. And it was an exact match to the DNA that they have found on the girls' bodies previously. So boom, thank you very much, joined it all together, ... Now we know that Gordon, Sarah's brother, and her husband, Angus Sinclair, were the perpetrators of this horrific crime. What a weekend away. Gordon himself was an alcoholic. He'd had a troubled childhood, as had Sarah. Wasn't a lovely good start to their life. Sadly, that is often the case with these crimes. When Sarah married Angus, Gordon and Angus got close. They obviously had things in common. Ugh. But they got close and they spent a lot of time together. Was this their first crime? Was it? I hope so, but I doubt it. The police then launched Operation Trinity. Dun, dun, dun. This went over old cases in Glasgow, Edinburgh, that possibly were unsolved and possibly linked to Gordon and Angus. They discovered that Angus had bought a caravan for fishing, apparently. He would go on trips out with Gordon in said caravan, fishing. And between 1977 and 1980, there would be many trips away in the caravan, many fishing trips. They found 4 cases during that time period that were incredibly similar to Kristine and Helen, and also Mary Gallagher. In all 4 cases, the 4 victims had been sexually assaulted, tied up and gagged with their own clothes, strangled with their own clothes, and their bodies just left to be discovered. No hiding of the bodies and things like that. So really pretty identical MO. But really annoyingly, a lot of the evidence, because they were very old cases and there was not much foresight given to these ones, a lot of the evidence was either lost or destroyed. Like, it's been so long now. Do you know what I mean? So that is really frustrating, isn't it? So thankfully for Kristine and Helen, in their case, the evidence was preserved and they were able to get forensics. And it's that like tireless police work over years and years and just keeping of evidence and being, what's the word? Diligent? Maybe? You know, that's how they got their justice in the end. In 2004, when all of this came to light and the evidence linked him to the 2 murders, he was questioned and he said nothing. It's annoying, isn't it? Literally just sat there for hours, didn't say anything or said no comment. You're in prison. You're serving like the rest of your life, 110% in prison. And why not just say? Because I think it would give the victims' families closure. Just evil. He was charged. He pled not guilty. So there was a trial. This happened in August of 2007, nearly 30 years after the crime was committed. The theory was that both men, Gordon and Angus, had raped and murdered the girls. The forensic evidence that they had was that the semen stains on Helen's coat were from Angus, and the profile of that was 1,000,000,000 to 1. So it was 1,000,000,000 to 1. It could have only been his DNA. Like the chances of it being his was 1,000,000,000 to 1. This is where I need to just be calm for a minute because I don't feel very well and I don't want to ruin my voice. So the prosecution decided to withhold this next piece of evidence, and it turned out to be a really stupid mistake. They had Angus's DNA on the ligatures that were made to strangle the two girls. They had his DNA, okay? But the profile of that DNA would suggest that it was a 390 to 1 chance that it was his DNA. That is still pretty conclusive, but the prosecutor did not want any doubt in the jury's mind because the other piece of evidence was 1,000,000,000 to 1. This was 390 to 1. So they didn't want to risk it being oh, well, could not be. Foolish. So that piece of evidence was not given to the court. The defence, they claimed that, yeah, okay, he did have sex with the girls, both of them, and it was completely consensual. Completely explain the semen stains on Helen's coat. I mean, it does, doesn't it? That being there, that only does really prove that he had sex with her. And she's not here to tell her side of the story. So that piece of evidence does only prove that. They also said that Gordon, who is dead now, he was the one that murdered the girls. Okay, so he murdered the girls. After they had had sex, Angus leaves, he goes on his merry way, and Gordon does the unspeakable. Also, and this, okay, chill, sore throat, don't know, anger it. The jury were not allowed to know, and so it was not mentioned in court. It couldn't be, it was not allowed to be known about his previous convictions. What? So the jury had not a clue that Angus is already in prison, serving life for 2 murders of young women, one 17, the same age as these 2 victims now, and an 8-year-old girl, and also the sexual assaults of many, many young girls. So, I mean, yes, there might be some rules. Yes, there's rules. I mean, just common sense. I mean, I don't like it. I don't like that at all. There's probably arguments for the reason why. I don't honestly know. I just think that's batshit. He's basically done this before. Perhaps it's so that you don't just not look at it and go, yeah, well, he's done it before, so he definitely did it, I guess. But okay. So they weren't allowed to know that. The jury were not allowed to know that his previous convictions. His defence claimed, and quite frickin' rightly, although it's really annoying, that there was not enough evidence to convict him on these murder charges. All they had was semen stains on a coat, and he'd already said, yeah, I did sleep with them. So they were like, do you know what I mean? There's not enough, what are we doing here? And then he was bloody acquitted. So he is still in prison for life, like he was at this point, still in prison for life, but that is not justice for Kristine and Helen and their poor families. That's rubbish, isn't it? So he's just been acquitted because there was not enough evidence. If they had submitted the evidence of his DNA on the ligatures that were used to strangle and murder the 2 girls, that would not have happened. It wouldn't have been thrown out of court because they would have had evidence. So it's really, really, really frustrating, isn't it? The public were furious. The families were furious. It didn't go down well. And to rub salt right in the wound, there was also a thing called double jeopardy. I'm sure you've heard of it. I had before, but I didn't really know what it meant. Basically, bear with me, I think this is right. If you'd been acquitted of a crime, okay, so there wasn't enough evidence, whatever, it's thrown out of court, you've been acquitted. Eyeball. You can then not be tried for that crime again. Right? Again, I think a very incredibly stupid law, really, because, for example, in this case, or many old cases, they didn't have the forensics that we have now. So, okay, say someone was taken to trial for something and there just wasn't enough evidence, forensics, to tie them to it, and then 10 years later, they're like, boom, 100% DNA match, it was you, can't be tried again. That seems batshit crazy to me, and luckily it seemed crazy to a lot of other people, and that rule was changed. In 2011, the Double Jeopardy Scotland Act was passed. Boom. Now, the people that were involved in the case against Angus, they were like, oh, yes. So they wanted to get together another case because now they can do it all again. It's okay. It's allowed. They want to get all their ducks in a row. They want to make sure they've got all the evidence that they can against Angus to get him convicted this time and get the justice for Kristine and Helen and their families. Time has gone on again, and there have been more advances in forensic technology, and they find more DNA evidence. Previously, they only had a small trace amount of DNA, Angus's DNA, on the ligatures that were used to tie up the girls and strangle the girls. Now they had something called a crime light, and this detected lots of DNA. And the DNA that they found was Gordon's and Angus's, and it was in the folds of the clothing that was used, which means that the two men they didn't just touch the clothes, they tied the clothes, they knotted the clothes, and it proved that on the 13th of October in 2014, at 69 years old, Angus Sinclair would go to court again, and this time there was no evidence missed out of the case. Thank you, please. Sinclair took the stand this time and he declared that he was innocent. He said that he had had consensual sex with both of the girls that night and that it wasn't him that had murdered them. Same story, stuck with that. Liar. And he was found guilty. Boom shakalaka. Get in. He was sentenced to 37 years, which is exactly how long it had taken for justice to be served. On the 11th of March in 2019, Angus passed away. He was suffering from really bad health and had had a number of strokes. He passed away in prison. What a long time for justice. Sadly, for, lots of victims, but there was 4 victims, even in this case, that the forensic evidence was lost or misplaced or destroyed, and they never got any justice. So that's really sad for their families to not have that closure. There is a case I haven't covered yet called Bible John, and it's really interesting and unsolved. However, when I was researching about Angus Sinclair, Bible John kept coming up. So I am going to do a video soon about Bible John and link in anything that I have found that might suggest that Angus Sinclair was in fact Bible John. Yeah, but I'm looking forward to digging in because it seems like there's so many different possibilities there, and it's interesting. I haven't done an unsolved case either yet, so that might be quite good. Okay, I managed to do this video. I'm really proud of myself. I am sweating out of my bum because I feel like I have a temperature. I feel like this ear is about to fall off and this ear is now starting to itch. So I think the safest thing for me to do is go and lay down with a cup of tea and another biscuit. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of Sin and Tonic. I look forward to seeing you next week for another true crime story. Hopefully a glass of gin and a head that doesn't want to explode. Thank you. Bye.